Hey Optimancers, Chris here. I received the following question from a patron of this channel. Chris, can you explain how you think RAW should be thought of? Now, RAW stands for Rules as Written. I've watched the Practical Optimization vid a few times. In my view, RAW is objective, like the concept of objective reality on which science is based in real life, and should therefore be universal. Do I misunderstand? How would you elegantly define or explain RAW? This issue vexes me, as you know. Thanks. Well, thank you, Gishlife, for the question. So, for anyone who hasn't heard the term, like I said, RAW is an acronym for Rules as Written. We use it all the time to describe what the rules say. And you know what? It is the most misused acronym in D&D. Have you heard phrases like, that's raw? By raw, I can do that. This is legal by raw. By raw, you can't do that. Whenever I see these phrases, my cynical side goes wild, because sure enough, most of the time, they're used incorrectly. And they shouldn't be, because let's be clear what raw is. Raw, by definition, is something that is written in the rules. Usually, raw tells us what we can do. In fact, most of the time, it only tells us what we can do. Though, once in a while, it does tell us what we can't do. Just not as often as you would think. I mean, take your D&D rulebooks. Flip to a random page. Point your finger at any random mechanics on that page. I bet most of you who do this are going to find that the rules you pointed to leave you to decide what you can't do. So, I did the exercise with my copy of Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. Opened to a random page, ended up seeing Way of the Astral Self Monk. Because of course I flipped to Monk. And so I picked a mechanic on that page, Visage of the Astral Self. So, what's written down? Well, here it is. Says I can summon a Visage of my Astral Self. Says I can do it as a bonus action, or part of the bonus action I use to activate the arms of the Astral Self. Says I can spend one key to summon the Visage for 10 minutes. Says it vanishes early if I'm incapacitated or die. It says it covers my face like a helmet or a mask. It says I determine the appearance. Let's stop there. So that's all rules is written. And one thing that should stick out is the rules are telling us what we can do. Notice the wording. Rules is written means it's written down. So although we agree you have to use your bonus action to summon the Visage, it's not raw that you have to. It's raw that you can. It tells us what we can do, but it doesn't tell us what we can't do. Can my Visage look like a Medusa's head? Well, it says I can determine the appearance, so yeah. Though the rules don't say if it's realistic, or if it's transparent, or if it can be used as a disguise. Those details are not covered by raw. So just because you can choose the appearance, the specifics are not there. If you make it look like a Medusa's head, does it petrify anyone? Again, the rules don't say. So it's not raw that you can do that. Now, there are some cases where the rules tell us what we can't do. Like, look at the rules on being incapacitated. They tell us we can't take actions or reactions. So there are rules in the game that tell you what you can't do. But for the most part, they tell you what you can do and allow us to determine what you can't. So doesn't this leave just an absolutely massive number of things not explicitly stated in the rules? Yes, absolutely. And it means most of the rules we agree on aren't raw. We agree you can't summon the Visage as a free action, but it's not raw that you can't. What we could say is the rules don't support you doing that, or the raw doesn't support you doing that, and that's it. But we can't say it's raw that you can't do that, because the rules don't explicitly say you can't. And this doesn't even start to cover the things the rules simply don't tell us. Realistically, in a tabletop role-playing game, your character has an infinite set of options. That means to cover all those options would require an infinite set of rules. We can't do that. So instead, they give us a few rules of things we can do, a few rules of things we can't, and some guidelines to fill in the gaps, and that's it. And most of what we play with ends up being a shared agreement between the players and the DM on how things should work. Usually the agreement is that the DM should decide what makes the most sense to them, and as long as we trust them to do that, we'll go along with whatever they decide. If we don't trust them to do that, we have a problem, because now we have an adversarial relationship between a player and a DM. Perhaps that player should look for another table. Now, if you are the DM, how do you handle the constant things in game that aren't explicitly covered in the rules? First off, and probably most of the time, we intuit how something is supposed to work, and we call this RAI, or rules as intended. So if we go back to our Astral Self example, the rules say I can spend a key point to create a Visage of the Astral Self. They don't say I can't do it for free. I would intuit The intention is you can't do it for free, even if it doesn't specifically say so. In most cases, we're not even going to need our DM to make a ruling here because we all understand how it's intended to work. We can expand on this tool by asking the designers how something was intended to work. Fortunately, the designers often tell us how an unclear rule is supposed to work, and a lot of these responses end up in Sage Advice, which we can access for free online. Now, Sage Advice is, as the name would imply, advice. It's not written in the rulebook, so it's up to you and your friends you play with whether you wish to take that advice or not. And if a rule doesn't explicitly say you can do something, or that you can't do something, or something definitely works, or something definitely doesn't work, then we're in that gray area where Raw doesn't cover it. And whatever you decide, it's not a house rule, because house rules change Raw. And if Raw doesn't cover it, then it ain't a house rule. The next tool we have is to come up with a ruling that we think works for the game we're playing. So if something isn't covered by the rules, and one decision would lead you to a game where things just aren't going to work. Maybe it's going to make somebody too powerful, or maybe it's going to make somebody kind of useless. Well, we can use our sense of how we want our game to play in order to help us make that ruling. We want to keep things at least somewhat balanced. So if the rules don't cover something, then we get to do some balancing with our rulings. And that's okay, and it's not a house rule, because if it's not covered by the rules, then we're not changing the rules. We can also make rulings based on what we think sounds fun. If we allow something that's not covered by the rules, is it going to be fun? Is it going to be fun for us? We don't just have to think about the players. DM's a player too. We call this often the rule of cool, allowing something you think is going to be fun. And just because you allow it once doesn't mean you have to allow it multiple times. Was it fun the first time? Great. Is it going to be fun the second time? Well, maybe we have a different decision, so we might come up with a different ruling. And the next tool we have as DM is just come up with whatever makes the most sense to us. So my character comes across a dragon that's shape changed into a frog that is potentially hostile. I try to convince it that it shouldn't attack us. We're dangerous for one thing. We don't mean it any harm. Hey, it might even want to help us. We come across a lot of treasure and would be willing to share it with a helpful dragon. So does my character make a persuasion check? Or maybe they make an intimidation check? Or maybe they make a deception check? Heck, maybe they make an animal handling check. I mean, it is currently a frog. The rules do not say, so none of these options are covered by Raw. We have some guidelines for those things that could give us some ideas, but maybe we don't do a check at all. Maybe the DM is happy just letting the conversation go where it will. Or maybe they do call for a check, and then they have to decide which check it'll be, and then they have to decide what's the DC of the check. Maybe the dragon's passive insight. Maybe something else. The rules don't say if this check should be easy, medium, or hard, or what it should be based on. We're just going to have to figure that out for ourselves. And here's where the most important tool comes in. As a DM, our job whenever the rules don't explicitly cover something is to come up with a ruling that makes the most sense to us. As a player, my hope is the DM is making rulings the best they can. And that's all we can really ask. If they're not sure, I'll put in my 2 cents. But if it's not in the rules, then they have to make a decision. Situations like this come up constantly in gameplay, where the rules don't cover something, so we hopefully trust our DM, and maybe they don't make the same ruling we would have. Maybe I figure it should have been an intimidation check, but they called for a persuasion check. Maybe I figured it should have been a DC of 10, but they asked for 15. As long as my DM comes up with a ruling that they think makes sense, and I trust that they're doing that, then they're doing their job as a DM, and it's okay if I would have gone another way. In fact, it's the DM's job to determine when things that are actually written in the rules make sense as well. The rules usually help us, but once in a while they lead to some strange conclusions. And in those cases, it's up to the DM to decide whether to just roll with it or make a ruling that this time the rules aren't making sense, so we're going to go a different way. For example, let's say you're on a big plane and you are an archer and there's somebody 600 feet away. So they're long range, so you have disadvantage. So you cast a fog cloud over yourself or darkness. I saw this pointed out online as one of the dumbest examples of Raw. Then what you have is this poor guy who's the target of this attack 600 feet away should have had disadvantage to attack him, but because he cannot see the attacker now has advantage. The advantage and disadvantage cancel out, and multiple cases of advantage and disadvantage don't stack. So the attack now all of a sudden is straight up and it makes no sense at all. So in those kinds of cases, it is up to the DM to decide whether they should just roll with it or make a ruling that this time the rules aren't making sense, so we're going to go a different way. And if they do that, that isn't a house rule. That is an individual ruling because this time the rules weren't making sense. Personally, I think a DM can go either way. It really depends on them and the table they play with. Me, I would probably roll with it, and I know it doesn't make sense. But you know what? It's not ruining my game, and it's not really ruining our fun. It might ruin our immersion, maybe. So yeah, I would probably roll with it. And you know what? I get shocked sometimes at the number of things not covered in the rules. I mean, I recently did a video on jumping. In that video, I say that once you complete the movement of a high jump, if you're in the air and you can't fly, then you fall to the ground. But is that raw? In actuality, the rules don't cover what happens at the end of a high jump. My assumption is that the rules on falling must say that if you can't fly and you end your movement in the air, then you fall. But someone told me that the rules don't actually say that, so I looked it up. And you know what? They were right. In fact, Jeremy Crawford was asked, does a creature take falling damage from a high jump? Does a rogue that jumps from a 10-foot fence take falling damage? Jeremy Crawford replied, in such a circumstance, I'd consider a fall to be a drop that exceeds the distance of the jump. In other words, not all the time that you go down, you're falling. This surprised me. I thought if you drop at least 10 feet, that's a fall. But what this brought to light is that the rules don't actually say that explicitly. So are all drops of 10 feet or more falling? Maybe and maybe not. You, your other players, and your DM are going to have to come to an agreement. And we should just determine what makes sense to us. And frankly, my assumption is at the end of a high jump you fall, and that is what makes the most sense to me. But I was wrong to say it was in the rules. It's not in the rules. The rules don't say what happens at the end of a high jump. They don't say that any drop of 10 feet or more is falling. I assume they did, but I was incorrect. Alright, so I think I've said enough about the definition of raw. I mean, it should be obvious. Rules as written means it's written in the rules. If that isn't part of your argument, then you shouldn't be using the term raw. But when I see raw used online, more often than not, it's actually used to describe things that aren't written in the rules or are excluded from the rules, and often for what is some actually pretty bad faith stuff. Let me give you an example. Player uses a spell rot tattoo to cast a spell. Let's say it's a Longstrider spell. So here's the Longstrider spell. Lasts 1 hour, no concentration, you touch a creature, target speed is increased by 10 feet until the spell ends. The player's next turn arrives, and they cast Longstrider again. DM asks, how are you casting it again? I thought you only had 1 tattoo. The player says, the tattoo doesn't vanish until the spell ends, and Longstrider lasts an hour, so I can cast it as often as I like over the next hour. DM says, I don't think it works that way. And the player responds, I can do it, rules as written. So what do they mean by that? Well, the spell rot tattoo item says that once the tattoo is there, you can cast its spell, requiring no material components. The tattoo glows faintly while you cast a spell and for the spell's duration. Once the spell ends, the tattoo vanishes from your skin. Now, what's the player going to point out? That the item just says that once the tattoo is there, you can cast a spell. And the tattoo is still there for the duration, so raw, they can keep casting it because the rules don't say you can cast a spell only once. They'll point out that if the designers wanted the item to limit you to a single casting, they should have said so in the wording. And they didn't, so it's legal, rules as written. But if we consider this argument, it's actually self-defeating. The argument that the spell rot tattoo allows you to cast a spell multiple times by raw would mean that it's written in the rules that you can cast it multiple times. But the argument they are actually making is that it doesn't say you can't cast it multiple times. So this isn't an argument that using that tattoo more than once is raw, because it isn't. The argument is that it's TRDSIC, they can cast it multiple times. So what is TRDSIC? The rules don't say I can't. And I'm telling you, when you see something iffy online that they are claiming is raw, you're almost certainly seeing TRDSIC. The term raw should be useful to us, but a rash of people claiming TRDSIC is actually raw makes it far less useful, because the rules cover a small portion of things. And if we assume the rules need to tell us everything we can't do explicitly, then they don't work. The rules don't say I can't use a spell raw tattoo to cast the same spell more than once, so I can by raw. That's not raw. It's TRDSIC. For that to be raw, it would need to say somewhere in the rules that if a feature says you can cast a spell, you can cast it an infinite number of times unless the feature specifically says otherwise, which isn't there. It's not raw. The rules don't say I can't shoot laser beams out of my eyes that do 1,000,000 damage, so I can by raw. No, that's not raw. That is TRDSIC. The rules don't say I can't choose a magic item as my genie's vessel, so I can have it be a ring of 3 wishes by raw. Again, not raw. TRDSIC. The rules don't say that an object I attack has to be unattended, so I can attack and destroy the enemy's weapon by raw. Not raw, that's TRDSIC. The rules don't say that the creature I stabilize has to be next to me, so I can stabilize creatures across the globe by raw. That's not raw, that's TRDSIC. The rules don't say that I can't take 10 short rests in a row, so I can convert pack slots into sorcery points and sorcery points into sorcerer's spell slots 10 times in a row. That's not raw, it's TRDSIC. Whenever you are told something is raw, here's what I suggest. Look for the rule that explicitly says they can do this thing. If the response includes phrases like, it's not written down anywhere, or it's not in the rules, or it doesn't say I can't do that, then we're not talking rules as written. We're talking about what the rules don't say you can't do. Except the rules don't say I can't includes an infinite number of absurd conclusions. There is nowhere in the rules that says if the rules don't cover something, the player can come up with any conclusions they wish. If it's not written in the rules, then it's not raw. Simple as that. But you know what? That doesn't mean TRDSIC isn't something that should be allowed. The rules on jumping don't say you can jump multiple times. They don't say how often you can jump at all. So it's not explicitly covered in the rules if it's a limited resource or not. Common sense would tell us we don't have a limited number of jumps. So that's how we play. Tabletop role-playing isn't a video game where all the parameters are locked in place for you. Tabletop role-playing allows infinite options, but those options need a shared agreement between the players and the DM. If TRDSIC is treated as, the rules don't say you can't, so therefore you can, this is not a playable game. But on the other hand, if TRDSIC is treated as, the rules don't say you can, so therefore you can't, it is still not a playable game. The rules don't say doesn't mean you can, and it doesn't mean you can't. It just means the rules don't say. And when the rules don't say, what do you need to do? Players, DM, shared agreement. But when I see raw used incorrectly, there's a specific case where it grinds my gears. When a player passes off TRDSIC as rules is written, and often it's something they know shouldn't work, and that the other players know shouldn't work, and the DM knows shouldn't work, but that player claims it's rules as written, like they're being clever. Finding something the rules don't say isn't clever. When you claim it's rules as written due to an omission in the rules, I'm sorry, that is the opposite of being clever. Now, I do understand. Sometimes this stuff is pointed out for entertainment purposes. Like, here's something the rules don't say you can't do. And isn't it absurd? Fine, if you find that entertaining, fine. But maybe stop using raw when it's not raw. Raw stands for rules as written. If you need to say, the rules don't say, then that's not raw. Raw is what the rules do say. And don't go on to say the rules are badly written because they don't include every single obvious thing. Rules that included every single thing that was obvious would be terribly written. And yeah, TRDSIC gets passed off as raw all the time. I want to give you an example of one spell and the number of ways in which TRDSIC I've seen passed off as raw. The Phantom Steed spell. So it starts off by saying a large, quasi-real horse-like creature appears on the ground in an unoccupied space of your choice within range. You decide the creature's appearance. Oh no, it's the Medusa's head all over again. Then it says, it is equipped with a saddle, bit, and bridle. Any of this equipment created by the spell vanishes in a puff of smoke if it is carried more than 10 feet away from the steed. Oh, carried more than 10 feet away. So I guess we can drag it more than 10 feet away. For the duration, you or a creature you choose can ride the steed. Then it goes on to say, when the spell ends, the steed gradually fades, giving the rider 1 minute to dismount. Oh, I guess I can ride it for the time after the spell ends while the steed is gradually fading. And wait a minute, it didn't say that the bit, saddle, and bridle disappear, so I guess I get to keep those. These things are all examples of TRDSIC. All of them. Yes, you can decide the creature's appearance, though it doesn't say that that gives you anything. It is equipped with a saddle, bit, and bridle, and it doesn't say what happens to them. It says they vanish in a puff of smoke if you carry them more than 10 feet away, but it doesn't say what happens if you drag them more than 10 feet away. It says you can ride the steed for the duration, and it doesn't say you can't ride it after the duration. These are all examples of TRDSIC. And here's the thing. Just because they're TRDSIC doesn't mean they're illegal. When I did my Phantom Steed video and I pointed out that it says for the duration you can choose to ride the steed, so therefore we shouldn't assume that you can ride it after the duration has ended, I had all kinds of comments of people saying that's how they play it. And you know what? If that's how you want to play it, that's fine. I'm not saying that Raw says you can't do that. You're not using a house rule. You're taking an area that isn't covered by the rules and filling it in with what works for you and what works for your DM. Just don't tell your DM that by Raw they need to let you ride it after the spell ends, because it's not written in the rules that you can do that. In order for the game to work, we simply have to agree with the other players and the DM that some things can be absent from the rules, and we can use common sense and our intuition and sage advice and what works for us to figure out how to handle them. Needless specificity, like no, you can't shoot lasers from your eyes or anywhere else. And here's a list of everything that isn't a weapon. Yes, you can ride the steed for the duration, but you can't ride it after the duration. You can stabilize a creature, but not if it's nowhere near you. You can cast Revivify on a creature that has died within the last minute. And yes, even though that the creature is now considered an object, it's still okay, honest. And yes, you can have the Astral Visage appear however you like, but if it looks like a Medusa, it doesn't petrify anyone. Or if it's a Basilisk. Or if it's anything else beyond just looking like something. And that's not a rule set that would be usable. A rule set that assumes you'll use some common sense and that the other players and DM will too does not make it poorly written. I mean, thank goodness it's written that way. I'll cover one more thing and then we're going to wrap this up. So I saw this online as an example of dumb raw. Dropping what you're holding as a free action and then picking it up as your free object interaction. You might as well just let people freely swap out their held items. So here's the rule on interacting with an object. Does it say this is an exhaustive list? No. Does it say that an interaction not listed here isn't an interaction? No. Does it say anywhere in the rules that you can drop an item without using an interaction? No. So although the rules certainly don't say this can't be done, they don't explicitly say it can. So it's not written in the rules that you can do this. This is not raw. Now, if you point that out to someone who says they can do this, I'll tell you what their response is going to be. Jeremy Crawford said he would allow a player to drop an item without using an object interaction. Okay, but he didn't write that in the rules, so don't say it's raw. In fact, he didn't even say it's the intended rules, or that another DM should allow it as well. It's never hit sage advice. I can predict another thing as well. The player who told you that it should be allowed because Jeremy Crawford says he would allow it will also say in other cases Jeremy Crawford's advice isn't raw and isn't good or flat out wrong. And when you have players who try to game the system, they're going to be hypocrites. I mean, they just tend to be. And claiming everything they do is raw is part of their arsenal of being a bad player. Personally, I like Jeremy Crawford's advice most of the time, but not all the time. And as a DM, it's up to me whether I try to emulate him with my rulings or not. I certainly let his rulings influence my decisions, but in the end, I make up my own mind. And honestly, we don't even know if Jeremy Crawford would allow you to drop something on each of your turns and then pick it up again in order to avoid sheathing and unsheathing weapons or other items. He's responding to a question without context. Maybe he means he would allow it once, but not if the player tried to game the system with it. Maybe he would allow it. I don't know, and neither do you, unless you happen to be Jeremy Crawford. In which case, welcome to Tree Monk's Temple, Mr. Crawford. Glad to have you here. So I want to wrap this up. Let's go back to the initial question. Chris, can you explain how you think raw should be thought of? Raw means rules as written. So if you use the phrase to support something, it should be explicitly written in the rules. Again, I would think this would be self-apparent, but if it was, we wouldn't have TRDSIC passed off as raw. TRDSIC is not rules as written. The omission of something from the rules means it needs an agreement between players and the DM as to what makes sense for them, not that the player can make up the rule and then coerce a DM with it, even when the interaction doesn't make sense. Now, if you're pointing it out for entertainment, fine, but the rules don't say I can't isn't as clever as you think it is. Most of the agreed rules we play by actually aren't completely rules as written. We use the rules to complement our shared understanding of how things should work. The term raw is definitely overused and often used incorrectly. In fact, most of the time I see it, it's not used to point out what the rules specifically say. It's used to point out what the rules have not said, which isn't helpful and it is misleading. And if something is omitted in the rules, the term "that's not raw" isn't particularly helpful because it sounds like that's not legal. But TRDSIC, like I said, often should be allowed. So try phrases like, "that's not in the rules," or "that's not supported by the rules," or "the rules don't say you can do that." I think that's a little more helpful, because if what's being proposed still makes sense, then sometimes TRDSIC is just fine. I mean, a lot of the time, TRDSIC is just fine, just not all the time. Thanks again for the question, Gishlife, and I hope my answer was helpful. And until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.